Okay, so that leaves us moving on to the last unit, which is international relations. So there are 7 essays on international relations that we're going to deal with. In terms of, first one is obviously like how successfully did Britain respond to international crises in this period? So there are four real big crises, and you can pick three. The obvious three would be the first three. But I think you could combine kind of Falklands Gulf War together maybe into like how they're dealing in decades wise. You could break this by decades as well. These international relation ones, it's kind of difficult to find that. You can make it just success, failure. You can make it by decades. You can make it by individual wars. Kind of a number of ways you can break it down.
I'd do it if it was me. I'd just personally do it by individual wars. I think that's
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
just tidy. But
Yeah.
yeah,
Yeah. So the ones we picked were the Korean War, Suez Crisis, Falklands War, and the Gulf War.
yeah,
So the first one with the Korean War, reasons why it was a success, boosted the relationship with the USA, which obviously, you know, Attlee and Truman working together on this initially coming in as like former Cold War leaders. So it just continues the World War II kind of dynamic of Britain and America working together and reinforces that after there were little bits of tension at the end when like kind of Churchill was sidelined by FDR. Um, Showed that Britain was a reliable member of NATO and the UN, because obviously this was the first real test of the United
tests.
Nations in
Yeah,
Korea, and
yeah.
that they were taken in there. The great irony being that obviously China's seat on the United Nations at this point was taken up by what is now Taiwan, so the nationalist government. So they were obviously very tiny, but the communist China wasn't recognized. And the great irony is the Soviet Union boycotted the meeting behind the UN resolution to go to Korea because they were worried about they were upset about communist China not being represented, so that allowed them to get a UN resolution to the
That's a
Korean
bit of
War.
an own goal, isn't
Yeah, yeah. The Soviet Union never missed another meeting again. So
it?
they obviously realized that wasn't a smart move. So the success was it meant that the North Korean invasion of the South was neutralized and the communist threat was neutralized because at this point of view there was still the big fear of the domino theory that rolls eventually into the Vietnam War, though we don't really enter that, so it kind of comes out. And it meant that this was kind of anchored the US into European defense via NATO, which is very modern and very apt right now that they're not going to be anchored into NATO anymore. But at this point of view, it was kind of a quid pro quo. Like Korean War was obviously Asia's more of America's sphere of influence. British Empire is really starting to be on the decline, not gone yet, but obviously Britain's interest in Asia is going to be lower. But it was kind of like a solidarity thing with Britain being involved in the Asian theater of war meant that America was more likely to stave off the Soviets in Europe. Um, in terms of failure, where you could say it was a weakening thing, and this is why this one I think is quite divisive. Britain remained a junior partner to the US, so it was America that was mostly calling most of the shots. So that was very interesting. I just read an article in The Economist literally about this, which was covering all of these and Britain's influence on them. Britain and Canada had to convince America not to use nuclear weapons in this war.
Yeah, right.
Attlee
I
literally,
think,
Attlee
is that
literally
true?
rushed to America to get Truman to promise that they wouldn't launch a nuclear weapon.
Was was that Truman? I mean, it was really MacArthur. It's
No, but
MacArthur,
MacArthur
right?
wanted it, as did a lot of Republicans in Congress, and Truman was under pressure.
I
And they
don't think I'm not sure if Truman wanted it though, did he? I don't think
no, I
so.
think, but you know what I mean? But it showed that Britain still has some influence to persuade him not to. The Canadians
Yeah,
were the ones who tried to argue with the Americans not to go into North Korea, and that ended up backfiring because it triggered the Chinese invasion. So that was a failure
yeah, that's right.
against them.
That's right.
So, um, so Britain influenced that invasion of North Korea that led to a lot of US casualties. It was Britain that kind of put like the Canadians had been opposed to that. But the bigger, I suppose, the impact internationally, it was successful, I think, because there were limited casualties and it was a successful operation. But domestically, it was quite difficult because it increased defense expenditure, which made it really difficult for Britain because the World War II economy was still under and rationing was still under. And like the entry to the Korean War was a major reason why Attlee lost, or one of the significant reasons why Attlee lost the 51 election to Churchill, I think.
Hmm.
So overall success or failure? I would say
Uh,
success internationally, failure domestically.
yeah, I think it's a mix.
Yeah.
I think it's mixed, but the conflict itself is, I guess, a limited success, right?
Yeah.
if because it was a North Korean invasion,
Yeah,
and they, even though it goes back and forth, and the Allies suffer a series of
yeah,
defeats at the hands of the Chinese,
yeah,
they do stop the invasion,
yeah,
right? And they maintain that the line of the 38th parallel.
yeah. And
So
containment is still practiced under
the
the
containment, yeah,
doctrine.
that's right.
Yeah,
Yeah, I think that's essentially fair
yeah,
from the North Korean perspective. But yes, at a cost.
yeah, yeah. So I would
Oh,
say,
yeah.
yeah. Oh, go on, sorry, Karen.
No, no, go, keep going.
So yeah, we can you can make the argument either way. I think domestically, obviously, hurt Attlee, but in terms of responding to international crises, it was beneficial to the Britain for an international reputation. That was then
Yeah.
destroyed by the Suez Crisis. That I think it's
I
hard to
love.
argue under any circumstance how this could be a success. Uh,
I was going to try to argue it was a success, but
you're going to argue it's a
just gonna.
success? Cool. I'll
Oh,
deal with the
just for the challenge.
go on
Just for
then.
the
I'll
challenge.
give it the failure, and then you try and tell me how the
That's just because
Suez
you'd like to
Crisis.
win, isn't it?
Uh, so obviously, NASA nationalizes the Suez Canal, which makes sense because it's in Egypt. That upsets the English and the French.
Well, I'm not sure if it makes sense. I mean, it's complicated, right?
Yeah,
So you have
but
the Suez Canal, you have NASA, who's an
you would want
Egyptian.
control over something that's in your territory, though. I mean, it makes sense to NASA to nationalize the Suez Canal. Um, Similar to the problems, obviously, with the Panama Canal dispute right now. The English and the French decide they don't like this, and because it's vital for their empire, well, fading empires that were pretty much gone by now, but still, the English and the French decide on an invasion along with Israel. They plan a pincered attack, whereas Israel would invade first, and then France and England would come in as international referees of this conflict. Um, and NASA responds to by sinking ships in the Suez Canal so it cannot be used, blocking trade. So exacerbating the belief that NASA has its thumb on a windpipe, which was the main real fear they had in the first place. But of course, this really infuriates the Americans and the global economy because the canal is blocked for everyone else who was using it.
Right. So this is I think the big point here is America. It's actually the US,
Yeah,
because Attlee
yeah.
doesn't consult Eisenhower
Eden.
before the sorry, my mistake.
So
Eden,
going back Korea, yeah,
not Attlee. Eden doesn't consult with Eisenhower
yeah,
about the invasion, and I think Eisenhower's position is that we're going to try to negotiate this
yeah,
one. So it
yeah.
really is a slap in the face for the
Yeah.
US.
No, even like the Americans see this as this looks really like imperialism. You know what I mean? Like a re-engagement with imperialism. This is like old school French and English just
Yeah,
going in power plays outside. And it looks ugly. And at this point in time, with the British and the French Empire breaking up, it's like, where are these new powers going to go to? And there's the danger that they side with the Soviet Union, not with America. So this annoys me in a number. NASA was kind of leading the unaligned movement and was buying like American equipment and stuff. And this move pushes NASA closer to the Soviet Union, which really irritates the Americans. And also then when Khrushchev crushes the Hungarian uprising, um, America is not really able to criticize them because they're like, well, the Soviets are just like, well, what did you just do? You went in as Westerners into Egypt, so therefore we can do what we like in Hungary. So it left it really, really difficult for the Americans to do that. And in the end, America puts enough pressure on them that the UK has to withdraw. So, and Eden is forced to resign. This is where, like we said before, Macmillan scheming around the back of Eden to get into power by supporting this and then claiming he didn't support it afterwards to get
yeah,
out of power.
that's
But
sneaky.
the big problem is like you ruin your international relation, you raise the specter of imperialism, you fail with your ultimate objectives, you annoy the Americans, and you have to withdraw. You don't even get
You don't even
anything
get what you
for all
want.
this
No,
all this
yeah,
huge diplomatic cost. You get nothing for it. So unbelievably catastrophic for Britain's reputation. And it also really confirms that Britain is no longer a superpower. Even though it's
yeah.
suspected, this is where it really becomes clear that,
So it brings down the Eden administration. That's gone,
yeah, yeah,
and it proves, I think it proves henceforth that Britain can't act successfully on the international stage without US support.
No, no.
That's the big takeaway from here. Yeah, I was joking a bit when I said I would argue for the success of the Suez crisis because I don't think you can.
I don't
It's
think
just
there's
a
anything. There's
disaster.
just literally nothing. I mean,
There's nothing good that comes out of this from Britain's point of view.
it's just like the biggest, it's like symptomatic of the biggest strategic catastrophe. I mean, has there been a worse British move internationally in history?
Yeah, it's embarrassing. Embarrassingly bad.
Yeah.
It's fun. Yeah.
And it damages relations. They're lucky that Macmillan, when he comes in, knew Eisenhower from the war and
Right.
was they were friends in the war. So that Macmillan manages to repair the damage quite quickly, but Eden has to go. And then Macmillan obviously becomes like an uncle figure for JFK when JFK is president. So that kind of the long-term damage to the relationship with America is not as big, but the damage to Britain's international reputation is huge. I think
Yeah.
my granddad was there in the Suez crisis.
Really.
Yeah. He was in Palestine.
But,
He was in Palestine in
wow.
48. He was in Malaysia for their independence fighting. He was in Cyprus. He was in Guyana. He was in Egypt for the Suez.
Wow.
Yep. Like this international relationship course is basically my granddad's military history.
Military career.
Well,
Okay.
yeah,
All right.
my uncle was in the Navy, so he was on the reserve list for the Falklands. So so it's like all the way through in the family. Yeah, so then we move on to the Falklands War under Thatcher. We talked about it already under Thatcher a little bit. So in what ways is it a success?
Do we
Well,
need to we'll assume knowledge of the Falklands
oh yeah, God, do you want to give a bit of
for now?
yeah, do you want to give background to the crisis? Sorry.
Sure. Yeah. Well, it's 1982,
Mhm.
and Argentina is being ruled by a pretty oppressive military dictatorship
Mhm.
under a military junta. The dictatorships is having problems, right? It's rather weak.
Mhm.
It's losing control, and they come up with this bright idea of taking the Falklands Islands as a way of I guess bolstering their support, their failing support in the Argentinian population. So this is the administration, the regime that's famous for the disappearances, right? So that people used to
Throwing people
kidnap
out of
and
helicopters into the
throwing
sea.
people out of helicopters. Yeah.
Yeah.
And so yeah, so and the Argentinians, so I guess the military junta gambles on the likelihood that the British are not going to do anything in response to this.
Yeah. I think
And you could say that that gamble wasn't a great bet.
they also
Just,
thought the Americans would support them because of the Monroe Doctrine, which is completely
mm,
mental against the British.
the anti-colonial,
Yeah. So they
yeah,
thought they would run with that. I think also they saw it that she was a woman. So I think there would have been
yeah,
a certain degree of macho sexism that she wouldn't respond. But you know, the Argentinians actually took a rock off the British under Callahan and they put a flag on it. And the British naval ship saw it and they complained. They didn't do anything about it. They just complained to the United Nations and nothing happened because obviously it was a
right.
left-wing government under Labour. So I think that may have emboldened the Argentinians to think, oh, they're just going to protest it internationally. They're not actually going to do anything. But Thatcher was in a difficult position, so she had to respond. And I think also the fact she was a woman probably felt she had to respond as well.
Right, because what's the population of the Falkland Islands? It's got, what, a
Really
couple of
tiny.
thousand?
Yeah, really tiny. But
It's
they
tiny.
all
We've got a
voted.
couple of thousand people
They
there.
voted for to remain, and they like it was 98% from 3,662 people.
3,600, okay, yeah,
Yeah,
right.
yeah, and a lot of sheep. And
And a lot of sheep, yeah.
they and I think that they really underestimated. And obviously, like Britain benefits a lot from Chile, relationships with Chile come in here, and that's where Pinochet ends up getting protected by Thatcher afterwards. But like, Argentina has a plan at this point to take over the rest of Patagonia. And
Yes,
so Chile knows they can't compete with the Argentinian army, so it's more in their interest to help Britain to knock out the Argentinian military, so they don't have to deal with that
yes, yeah,
side. But yeah, so
yeah.
the it happens, and
So,
Thatcher responds
yeah,
very quickly and rallies the whole country behind it. Her leadership is seen as really strong, and also like that sexist view. Then having a, well, I mean, to be fair though, like we'd always had strong female leaders because of Queen Elizabeth and the Armada, and then also like
but so do the Argentinians.
Elizabeth
Let's
I
be fair.
and
They
Victoria.
have Eva Peron.
It's not the same. Uh, and then
She's a
they had,
personality.
yeah, they had European and UN support, so it's internationally legitimate. That's the key, I think. With the Korean War, it's
Yeah,
internationally legitimized, as is the Falklands War, as is the Gulf War, it's the Suez Crisis.
but not the Suez.
No, that's
Not the
the one
Suez
that goes
crisis.
really bad. No, definitely was not internationally supported, the Suez. And this restores Britain's sense of greatness after the Suez Crisis. So the country hasn't had really any real military conflicts or like things to celebrate. So the Falklands War gives them a victory that allows that boost, and this in turn boosts Thatcher's popularity, so that she helps her win the 1983 election. So the
Yeah,
great,
so I guess maybe we should mention just quickly what happens, very, very
yeah, go
quickly.
on, yeah.
Because there is, so there's military engagement
Mm-hmm.
in the Falklands. The British sink a British submarine sinks the General Belgrano,
Mm-hmm.
kills all the crew, 360 Argentinians. The Argentinians by missile destroy the HMS Sheffield.
Yeah.
And then the British land troops, right? They land troops on the Falkland Islands, and eventually the
Yeah,
Argentinians
special
surrender.
forces and that against like what are effectively kids armed with guns,
Yeah,
the
yeah.
Argentinians send in.
I think people are killed in that too, aren't they? In that engagement.
Yeah, they are goose green balance, but mostly Argentinians. There's because it's like it's just it's a professional army versus a bunch of kids.
Yeah. Right. So, and of course, Argentina's not really very well prepared for a full-on engagement with an angry Britain, a Britain that's determined to take
And
action.
the logistics are quite impressive to wage war that far away as well, because they have to wage it off the back of the aircraft. They've got no land
Yeah.
bases anywhere close to support this.
Yeah, that's right. So, it's a clear British victory on the
Yeah,
14th of June. The Argentinians surrender.
yeah,
So there's no ambiguity about the
yeah.
outcome of that conflict.
No, in terms of failures, there's some criticism showed that Britain could not go to war without the support of the US. Because if the US had said no to this, that wouldn't happen. So again, it
Sure.
continues that idea that without US support, without US work, Britain in an international standing needs America to do anything. Um, and needed Chilean support as well. Some critics say it was an unimportant war that cost a lot of money, because that money could have been spent elsewhere. And for
That's a
ideas
good.
we had, that
Yeah.
Britain had been thinking of getting rid of their passports and almost moving them off
That's
before
right. That's the funny thing is that Britain actually probably would have given Argentina the Falklands.
negotiated rather than fought. Once you
Negotiated.
invade,
Yeah,
you
if it
have to
was,
defend
but
it.
once you invade and you put troops there, then it's against, it's an affront to national honor.
Yeah, it's a different question.
But the cost is pretty interesting. I mean, apparently to defend the island
Yeah.
after this, it costs 1.5 million pounds per islander. So how many islands is 3,000 and
I wonder
3,200?
if it would have been just better to say to those islanders, "Do you want 1.5 million each? Leave, and we'll give it to Argentina, and we solve all the problems." Might have worked. I think they'd take it, surely.
You think?
It's because it's still an unresolved conflict, as Argentina still disputes the sovereignty of the islands, and the big problem is that they
Yeah.
found oil off the coast. That becomes,
Oh, did they? Okay, yeah.
yeah,
And so, and you have personal experience of this, don't you, James, having traveled in Argentina
having
extensively?
having been with an Argentinian when they found oil, and we were both like, "Oh crap," because it's going to cause difficulties in the relationship and stuff. Yeah, 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 I've been down.
Because this is the fascinating thing is that I think for the British, I know this is slightly off topic, but I can't. For the British, it's not such a big deal. I mean,
No, it's
it helped Thatcher win the election.
Maradona's hand of God, I think, is a bigger thing for us in
But the
Europe.
Argentinians are obsessed with it, and they still
Yeah,
are.
yeah, yeah, yeah.
I mean, every Argentinian knows about the Falklands War and is angry. Well, not every,
No,
but
every they learn about
they are
Ukraine.
pretty angry about it. And like, I can give you an anecdote. When I was I went to Buenos Aires, and they have a museum dedicated to the Falkland Island in part of the city, and in the museum there's a map that suggests that Britain is still expanding its empire.
No,
Like
really?
so that's so that the Argentinian perspective in at least in the museum is that Britain is this sort of power hungry old imperial tyrant that's
Mm.
spreading its tendrils, still spreading its tendrils throughout the
Yeah.
war,
And
throughout the world. Sorry,
and there's a lot of sympathy for the Falklands or Malvinas, as
that's
Argentinians
awesome.
call it, in South America. So there is a
Oh
diplomatic cost for
yes,
Britain of this war as well, albeit with countries we
yeah,
have very limited relations, so not as costly as with other ones, but
yeah,
there is some legacy of it. But I would say in terms of the war again, the war itself is a success.
definitely,
It's just the
yeah,
consequences
absolutely.
of it, the
And
legacy.
it helps Thatcher win the '83 election.
Yeah, yeah, yeah,
It does a massive, yeah. So it's an
yeah.
overall gain, I think.
Labour supporters would probably say then it was a massive failure. So it gives a prop to that government.
So would you say success?
I
I think
would
so.
probably say it was a success. Yeah, I'd say the Suez is the only one that's an out and out failure. So the others are
Yeah, I agree.
slightly more successful. I
Absolutely,
think
I agree.
Britain kind of knows its place in the other ones, I think, whereas in the Suez crisis, it seems to think it's still the global superpower. Then you've got the Gulf War with Saddam Hussein. So obviously Saddam Hussein invades Kuwait. Britain has an agreement to protect Kuwait as a protector, I assume in return for oil of some kind. And this becomes an aggressive movement. This action is again supported by UN resolution to stop the invasion, the same way as the Korean War is. So, it's got a proper mandate. Um, they successfully liberate Kuwait from Saddam Hussein, which is the main objective again. So similar to the Korean War, Falklands War, they hit their main objectives. Strengthens US-British relations because Britain does a lot of ground support from there. And John Major shows British diplomatic strength by he's the one who creates the protected zone for the Kurds in the north. But there are big problems with this, and we'll talk about what happens. So Thatcher had wanted to act immediately, but Bush wanted to wait for allies. So Thatcher would have gone in like the Falklands without waiting for United Nations protectorate. But the fact they did wait for it and John Major takes over midway through is really important. So Britain could have been isolated there, but Bush was right to wait for UN resolutions because having that international shield of a UN operation makes things much easier. They failed to remove Saddam Hussein, which obviously then who remained in control of Iraq, which led to future conflicts, and of course came back to the 2003 invasion later on. And the other big problem with this conflict was America saying to the Kurds and the Shias in the south, Kurds in the north, rise up against Saddam Hussein and we'll help you liberate.
Yeah,
And they
yeah,
rose up, and the Allied forces stopped on the border and went, actually, no. And then Saddam
yeah.
Hussein
They
used
got
chemical
butchered.
weapons on both of those groups, which
Yeah,
meant they were surprisingly American Britain, because I did obviously my master's on the 2003 Iraq War and that period. I was doing my master's in that era. Like I read primary documents where like the Americans were shocked that the Kurds and the Shias were not super happy to see them as liberators in 2003. And I was like,
yeah,
really? Really? You told them
yeah,
to rise
yeah,
up, abandon them, and let them get chemical weapon. You expect them to be happy to see you back and trust them.
yeah,
So that caused, again, there's the success of the operation versus the legacy of what comes out of it. And like many in the Middle East still saw this as another Anglo-imperialism of Americans and British getting involved, even though it was UN sanctioned. So I
yeah.
think, yeah,
It's interesting. I mean, in the question, how there are more international crises than these. So, for
yes.
example, the Vietnam War, but there's not necessarily
You could
mention
bring in
these
Vietnam, I think,
others.
but we don't really enter it. So that's more, I think Vietnam's impact for Britain is more domestically on breaking up Wilson's cover.
Yes, yeah, yeah. Okay,
Yeah.
yeah. Obviously, there's no British troops in Vietnam.
No, so I think Gulf War, like the Falklands, like the Korean War, successful operations is what the collateral damage is. It's going to weigh up where you think it's more important or
Right.
not, I think. Okay. So then the next one is how close was the relationship between Britain and the USA? So I broke this into decades because I think it's easy to do it in like the 50s and the 60s and 70s and the 80s and 90s. So in the 50s, um, obviously the relationship was close over the Korean War because, as we talked about before, they fought together under a UN banner there. Even though the UK was seen as a junior partner in the war, so it's not as close, they were still working together on it. But the big shocker in the 50s was the Suez Crisis. So obviously, the Suez Crisis showed that the UK was no longer able to carry any actions against American wishes, and really upset the relationship because it cost America in how they were dealing with the Soviet Union invading Hungary, and also it meant that the Americans had to take over Britain's role of looking after the Middle East after the Suez Crisis because Britain was no longer trusted in the region, and it forced America to expand out its security. But luckily, the damage was massive but short-lived because Eden was sacrificed, and Macmillan and Eisenhower. had been personal friends during the wartime, which meant it was quite easy for Supermac to repair the relationships with the United States afterwards. So I would say that the 50s began and ended with strong relationships. The Suez Crisis was like a kind of temporary blip in the middle.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah, would you agree?
Um,
Yeah, and then the 60s and 70s, I think if you're looking at it, again, it's a combination of like some very strong points and some blips throughout that period as well. So um the Cuban Missile Crisis was massively important because in the same way Macmillan and Eisenhower have been friends in the 50s, Macmillan was basically became like an uncle figure for JFK. And JFK was on the verge of ending up in a nuclear war at the beginning. Macmillan cautioned against it, and it was his deft handling of advice that helped, and this was again in that Economist article, helped JFK navigate through the Cuban Missile Crisis and avoid escalating the conflict. So I think that is quite important in the relationship that JFK looked at Macmillan as a kind of experienced person he could lean on. There was also warm personal friendships between Carter and Callahan at the end of the 70s. Not that they really dealt with much, but they liked each other, both from the left. Where there was a certain degree of weakness was the loss of empire and decolonization weakened how useful Britain was for the Americans, because as Britain lost its empire, it became a much less powerful country, which means it was much less needed by the Americans.
yeah, so that's an interesting element, isn't it? When you're
Yeah,
thinking about the relationship, it
yeah,
doesn't. It means that the nature of, I think Britain and the US have always been close,
yeah,
but the nature of that relationship is different, has
yeah,
been changing, hasn't it? In the
yeah.
Second World War, it's really as allies. In the beginning, it's allies on equal terms, and
Yes.
it very soon
Churchill
becomes
starts to get sidelined. I think it's really like when you're looking at the Tehran conferences where you start to see the shift.
yeah,
Yeah.
and yeah, that's right. And British prestige or British power starts to dwindle very quickly, even in the second half of the Second World War.
Yeah.
And so the relationship becomes increasingly asymmetrical.
Yeah.
I don't think that means it becomes any less close,
No.
but it does mean that now it's the US that has the upper hand, and it's Britain that's interested in making sure that America has enough of an interest, for example, in European security.
Yeah. Which they do
Um,
quite well. But even now, like Starmer's trying to do it, with Macron to keep Trump engaged in Europe, but he has not really any interest in the Ukraine war. It's quite difficult now. I think the relationship is slowly weakened.
well,
It was
it's
probably at its
it's it's
height.
changed. Yeah,
Yeah. Although I think it gets under Thatcher and Reagan, I think it gets closer to what it used to be because I think Reagan sees Thatcher as an equal in a way that none of the other presidents did, except maybe JFK to Macmillan. That's only because he saw him.
right. But maybe on a personal level, but obviously
Yeah.
not on a geopolitical level.
I think Thatcher and Blair
Hmm.
have a much higher standing on international relations than any other UK prime minister in our court period of our course, I think. Blair was a driving force in Iraq, Afghanistan, Kosovo.
Hmm.
You
A
know,
bit like, in a way, the fact that Britain's been a driving force in the Ukraine war. I mean, in terms of
yeah.
its leadership in European defence.
Boris Johnson, one of the few things he did that was quite good. Yeah, he was on top of that from an early period. But I think that's because Boris Johnson sees himself as Churchill reincarnate. So therefore,
Yeah, that's right. Right.
he wants to be.
Okay. Yeah.
Yep.
So anyway, so in the 60s and 70s, this is obviously the period of decolonisation.
Yeah, so I think that
So
decolonization also causes problems because the Americans are competing in an ideological war with the Soviet Union to get the influence over the former British and French colonies. So I think that,
yeah,
but Britain is just less useful to the Americans. They,
would you say? Yeah, I was thinking about this as I was reading it.
yeah,
I mean, with the Atlantic Charter, for example,
yeah,
it's clear that the US at that stage sees itself as an anti-colonial entity,
yeah, yeah.
and Britain and France as these sort of old
I would say
colonial
it sees
powers that
itself as,
eventually have to eventually have to reform
yeah,
and modernize. But it then becomes, there's a bit of a reversal, I think,
mm,
because once the Cold War begins,
yeah,
the US is now very keen
yeah,
for the Western powers to maintain their interests in, different parts of, whether it's
yeah,
Asia or Africa or
yeah,
South America.
yeah.
Do you think that's right?
Yeah, I think so, a little bit, mainly because also they know they're ideologically a bit screwed because like if you're an independent country in Asia or Africa and you're looking at the Soviet Union and communism, which is class conflict and racially equal versus a Jim Crow Southern America, um, it's obvious which way your alliance could lie. And that was a bit of a problem for them, I think.
Mm.
And they just see Britain as a less reliable partner because obviously LBJ then gets problems with the Vietnam War because Wilson irritates him
Yeah,
because Wilson supports it in public but doesn't send any troops. And
yeah,
that's, I
yeah.
think, the first time the Americans have had to go into war in the post-Second World War era without British support.
Without British, yeah.
Yeah. And
It's
we've always been the
probably,
ones that cover them so they can claim it's like over Iraq and Afghanistan. It's not just us, there's Britain
yeah,
as well. We're like that lackey that gets sucked along through all the little wars. It's like,
right.
backup
Although
force.
that, in hindsight, Wilson may have been lucky in not doing that, given
Yeah.
that the Vietnam War finishes off, LBJ himself,
Yeah,
right?
yeah, yeah.
So,
And Heath has no real interest. His main focus, he's probably the only prime minister who was more focused on Europe than America. I think Blair was equally focused on both, and I think every other prime minister's been more focused on America. So I think the 70s is probably the lull, apart from the Suez crisis, which is probably the low of the Suez crisis is probably the low of the low. And then I
yeah,
would assume the
yeah.
Vietnam War is the second
But
lowest.
that's in the 50s,
Yeah, yeah,
since
yeah.
we're looking at
Yeah,
chronology.
I'm just
Yeah.
saying, like overall, like
Okay.
where the relationship was at its lowest point during this course,
Yes, yeah,
91 to
yeah,
97, it's Suez is the lowest point, and
yeah,
Vietnam's probably the next lowest. And then in the 80s and 90s, it's pretty strong in general because like Reagan and Thatcher had a very close relationship personally and ideologically. They were bringing
yeah,
the same
yeah,
economic policies, same international policies, hostile to communism, free market economics, both of them dealing with the left wing of their country. You know, they used to consult a lot on a lot of stuff. I think they probably have one of the closest prime minister to president relationships
yes,
post-war.
yeah,
The US assisted the UK in the Falklands War with logistics. Didn't want to actually get involved in the fighting because it's against the Monroe Doctrine, but they did it there. Thatcher assisted with the American bombing of Libya in 1986. They were backing each other up. Both opposed US UN sanctions against apartheid South Africa. A bit more problematic for their legacy, that one. They worked together in the Gulf War. Although so that's America, obviously not Thatcher and Reagan. That would have been like Thatcher initially and then Major, but with Bush. But again, the Gulf War was successful, and eventually in the 90s they worked together on the Bosnia crisis in 1995, despite initial American reluctance. So like a Major was able to convince Clinton to go in to Bosnia, and again, obviously at the end, after, of course, like Blair and Kosovo, Blair led that one. So a lot of the European war action was led by Britain in the 1990s. So all of that was really, really strong. In terms of negatives in that period, Thatcher was unhappy with Reagan's negotiations with Gorbachev to reduce nuclear weapons. So she was the one who tried to convince him not to, because Reagan was kind of like didn't wanted to really reduce it down, but Thatcher saw it as a strategic necessary as a deterrent. She also liked just like the SDI, Strategic Defense Initiative, or Star Wars as it was called, because she thought that was a waste of money and not really. And also, this SDI would make Europe more vulnerable because if America's got a complete missile shield over it, they're less likely to defend Europe because they don't need it anymore or to be as active. And
yeah,
lastly, I think the fact that Reagan invaded Grenada, which is a Commonwealth member in 1983, was really problematic because Thatcher had to deal with it. But again, what it does show again is that Britain was very much the junior member in this partnership. But I think again the relationship was pretty close all the way through, apart from Suez and Vietnam.
yeah.
Would you agree?
Yes, I agree. Yeah.
Yeah.
So I would say close, but the nature of that relationship changes.
Yeah. Do you want to reinforce what you mean by that again?
I mean, in the sense that Britain's the loss of the empire
Yeah.
uh, makes Britain really the junior partner in this relationship. So it's an asymmetrical one.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
Um,
Yeah. We have
but
to follow
that
what they
doesn't
say. And
that
when
doesn't
we
mean that
don't
it's
in
not
Vietnam, we
close.
get consequences.
Yes.
Yep. Cool.
Okay. Conquered.
There on that one.